to welcome you to today's webinar, A Cyber Tale, How Failed Security Policies Exposed 40 Million Customers. So our presenter with us today, we have Dave Buster. So Dave is an industry veteran with over 35 years of experience in design and product management technology solutions. Dave spent over 13 years with Cisco Systems, supporting federal government agencies with data security architectures. Later, Dave worked in smart grids, storage, and financial industries as a security architect. Now, with global knowledge, Dave manages a worldwide portfolio for cybersecurity courses. Dave has a BS in engineering and an MBA in North Carolina from North Carolina State University. He holds the Security Plus certification and the CISSP certification. So now I'll hand this over to Dave to tell us all about this cyber tale.
We're going to talk about an actual attack that happened a few years ago that you're all probably familiar with. We're going to dip down into it and talk about some of the details of it, but we're not going to make this a super technical presentation. This is accessible to just about anybody who has any interest in computers and things like that. We're not going to make it technical, but we are going to talk about the people problem that happened with this attack as we go through it. So the story you're about to hear is completely true. We've double-checked all the facts that we can. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent because in some cases they're guilty. And I'm talking about organizations. But the point of the story, we're gonna learn how cybersecurity depends on people, not just technology. There were technology failures in this story, clearly, but those technology failures in every case were caused by people not doing the right things. So we're going to talk through some of that. As Sarah said earlier, if you've got any questions, type them in the little chat window down there and she'll catch them and ask me, and we'll go through this. The story begins. There is a little company named Fazio Mechanical Services in Pennsylvania. Just a few $1 million a year, what, $25 million a year or so. This little company installs the big coolers that you see in convenience stores and grocery stores. These are those big glass front refrigerated machines. They would install them, they would maintain them, et cetera, et cetera. And they had a kind of a regional footprint in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, Ohio, and they would go around installing and maintain these systems. They have most of their employees are out in the field. They have a small front office with just a handful of employees. And around 2013, early in the year, one of their employees clicked on a link in a suspicious email. Now, we know that this happened. We're not going to give the name of that employee, but there was some investigation into that. But it infected their computer. Now, the reason that happened was that they had a kind of a part-time IT guy that managed their systems, and they had installed Malwarebytes as their antivirus choice on their computers in the office. And that's actually a pretty good little antivirus software package. However, they chose the free version of Malwarebytes, and it does not continuously scan. The free version only scans once when you turn it on, and then you have to remember to come back once a week or once a day and rescan repeatedly. They weren't doing that. So they had scanned a few weeks before, found nothing, and it was just sitting there. So this person, their laptop, their desktop or whatever in the office got infected. It means that the bad guys, the attackers, were able to install just a little bit of code on that computer, and they installed a keylogger that would capture all the keystrokes on that machine. And they were also able to install some other software that would poke around the other machines in the office and do some similar things, so that eventually there were keyloggers installed on several computers in that office. Now, Fazio doesn't really have much of their own to steal. I mean, why would someone choose this target? But we'll go into this and talk about that. What we found is that the Fazio computers had something called the Citadel malware package. Now, it's kind of a derivative of a program called Zeus, which is another malware package. Zeus was a very sophisticated malware package that was used in some banking attacks. It's very high profile, very good at doing keyloggers and things like that. So Citadel is a derivative of that. And using that package, the attackers were able to install keyloggers on every machine in the office to steal credentials. Now again, the interesting thing here is this malware had been out for some years, and on the Malwarebytes website itself, this is the virus checker they were using. There's a blog discussing this particular piece of code. So we know that Malwarebytes would have picked up this code if it had been run appropriately, but nobody had run a scan, so it didn't happen. So this is not new information. This was malware that had been around in the environment for over a year, and someone used it to hack into these computers. So there was a kind of a breakdown here where people didn't run the malware software, the virus checkers. So as we go forward, though, why would somebody put keyloggers on this little company? So what happened next was someone in the office had access to a partner portal provided by a very, very large retailer. So like a lot of large companies, they do a lot of work to smooth out their supply chains and make transactions as easy as possible with their partners and suppliers. This particular retailer had set up a partner portal that allowed other partners who were buying and selling with that retailer to come in and do invoicing and billing and all that through this portal. Made things very, very convenient. And so it worked out really well for them. And of course, Fazio Mechanical was putting in some coolers for this retailer, and so they had credentials to log into the partner portal. That's all fine, but the problem was the retailer who owned this portal didn't really see this portal as a attack surface because they knew only trusted suppliers could come in through this portal. What they didn't think about was that if one of their partners was compromised, then the attackers could come in the same way, and that's exactly what happened. The attackers logged into this portal using Fazio's credentials. They poked around for a little while, looked at all the invoices and billing and all that stuff for Fazio, and then because this was a web page basically that had not been vulnerability scanned and locked down tightly, they were able to find some vulnerabilities in this web page, and they were able to escalate their credentials. So the attackers escalated credentials from being a user of the web page to actually an admin for that machine. There's a lot of ways to do that. Well, I'm not really sure which way they used it. Could have been a SQL injection attack or something like that. But basically, the attacker came in with credentials from Fazio, escalated credentials, and got control of the retailer's server. Now, the next step was, once they had that server, they installed some scanning tools on that server and started scanning the entire retailer network. Now, this is another area where the retailer had made a mistake. They had set up their entire network, tens of thousands of machines. It's a very large retailer. They'd set it up as a completely flat network. And so the bad guys got into their Active Directory server, managed to get some encrypted files, and we'll talk about that in a minute for passwords and authentication credentials. But the bad guys were also able to scan the whole network, see every device on the retailer's network. Now, what we would normally recommend is if you're going to have a network and you want to lock things down, that one of the best things you can do is segment it so that people in finance, that network is separated out from sales network, which is separated out from operations network, which is separated out from manufacturing, what other groups you've got. That way, if an attacker gets into one segment, they can't break through to the other segments. But in this case, they didn't segment their network, so the attackers could go anywhere. They got into this Active Directory server, and because they could escalate credentials on the original server they were on, they were able to get in there, and they were able to download a file that included every employee and machine's login credentials. Now, the good news is that these login credentials were encrypted, everybody's user ID and password. So they were not able to read them directly, but they were able to crack them. So what happened was the bad guys downloaded this file, and we've done some post analysis of this file. A lot of people have done an analysis on this whole break-in. It's a pretty large file, thousands and thousands of logins. But what happens is if you're an attacker and you want to guess one person's password, it could take years and years to brute force that password. But if you have a file of 100,000 accounts and run the same brute force scan against the entire file at one time, you can get some of those to break. Surely somebody is going to do some stupid things, and that's exactly what happened here. In the case of this retailer, we had 4,312 people use the password Jan 3009 pound. And that is a guessable password. It has a month in it and just a simple number and a simple symbol. So that's less than 1% of the total number of passwords out there. But still, if 4,000 people use that same password, they were probably taught to do something like that in a training class or something and just left it. You'll see other passwords here like summer and winter and other things. What happens is if the retailer had a policy, it was not well enforced, but said every 3 months you have to change your password. So people would just use the name of the season as part of their password, summer, winter, fall, et cetera, et cetera. There were also other passwords, but essentially what happens is with tens of thousands of passwords available, some of them will be guessable. So they ran the dictionary attack against the whole file. And they were able to guess quite a few of them. As a matter of fact, when investigators did this same action after the event, the brute force attack by the investigators cracked about 86% of the passwords. That's a pretty high number. So what we find is that about 0.2% had 6 characters in length. So they were okay. That, not many of the people had that, but 7 characters, 17% only had 7 characters in their password. That was pretty easy to brute force. And then 8 characters up to 30%. You can tell that most people have 8 characters. That must be what their password policy is, because 30%. So if you had 30 plus 17, you're almost half of people have 8 characters or less. So this is a pretty weak password policy system. And you can see the top 10 base words that were used in the dictionary here. What we find here is that although an individual password is difficult to brute force, if you have enough accounts and you can brute force them all at the same time, you'll get into some of them. It's like having some keys and you get 1,000 doors to try a key on. Eventually, you're going to get that key's going to work. So that's what's happened here. So the attackers got into a lot more servers and a lot more computers all over this retailer's network, including some of the administration servers, but they didn't stop there. Next, they discovered that since this was a flat network, they were able to get on the point of sale terminals. This retailer had cash registers with point of sale terminals with credit card readers. These had been specially designed and built for this retailer, and the attackers discovered the point of sale terminals. They figured out who had manufactured these terminals. They were able to download the documentation on the terminals, and they were able to write some code to attack the point of sale terminals. Now here's where it gets interesting. As far as credit card handling goes, when you're handling credit card information, we all know that credit card numbers are supposed to be encrypted in transit and at rest in storage. We never leave credit card numbers unencrypted. That's part of the PCI DSS standard. The only place where a credit card number is not encrypted is when you first zip it through that slot and it's sitting in RAM inside this terminal while it's being encrypted to be sent out over the wire. So the attackers wrote some code that would sit inside the point of sale terminal and just scan the RAM every few minutes, and whatever it found, it would load that into a little file and send it out to the attackers' computers. So they had some servers set up in various locations and they were collecting these files. Now we know that this happened probably middle of 2013. The attackers loaded the software. They were able to reverse engineer this RAM. They were able to load some software and upload it into the point of sale terminals. This is interesting because we have evidence that they loaded up to 5 versions and experimented with it at length before they got it right. They played with the software and they tinkered with the software so that it was reliable, it would always work, it would scan every credit card number and send it to them in a file. They also tinkered with it to reduce the amount of traffic it generated so they could stay below thresholds, and they only sent the traffic during store hours because they didn't want to arouse suspicion by having a bunch of traffic going out, outside of normal store hours. But the real problem here was that the point of sale terminals had no way to validate when some software was uploaded to them and they were instructed to boot it up and run it. They had no way to validate that it was valid software, that it was not unauthorized. So what happened was the terminals, you send them the software, they'd start running it and then instantly just start sending credit card numbers back to the attackers. I do think it's interesting that the attackers were very deliberate and intentional about writing this code, and especially the fact they went through 5 versions. In some ways, they were more disciplined than a lot of programmers I know that are writing legitimate applications, but these might have been legitimate programmers doing this. So these point of sale terminals were attacked. They got their software in, they got it working. They were able to scan. Now the next thing that happened was the code was introduced, and since it started running on a half a dozen or so terminals, they were able to then deploy it to thousands of terminals. Now we look at this code after the fact. The stolen credit cards numbers were sent to some servers. There's varying, depending on which account you read. Some of them were in Miami, some were in Brazil or whatever. But it appears that those were temporary servers that the attackers had just taken over to collect the data. Then all the data was forwarded to other servers in the Ukraine and Russia. It's interesting that the code itself had the name embedded in it, Rescator, which is, we don't know who that is, but there's a Ukrainian national programmer that tends to use that. So the FBI has a name attached to that now, and I think he's on a wanted list, but I don't know if they'll ever catch him. Anyway, this code started running and it ran really well. It started running and the information started being exfiltrated. We were leaking information out of the system. They were sending files out full of credit numbers. And the intrusion detection systems at the retailers started going off. They had spent over $1 million on a intrusion detection system. They hadn't had the right training on it, and it hadn't had time to learn their traffic patterns yet, or so they thought. So they believed that they had a bunch of false alarms, so they ignored it. So this thing went on for weeks and weeks. It actually happened during the holiday season in 2013, starting with the Black Friday, after Thanksgiving, when all the retail sales start to accumulate all the way through the early part of December. And it was a very successful hack. It was actually timed to be in the most busy part of the business year for this retailer for that particular reason. So at the end of the day, poor Target Corporation, this breach exposed about 40 million credit cards between the end of November and mid-December. We see that the data was being forwarded to Miami and Brazil. The data was encrypted on its way so that it was difficult to tell what that data was. It was just small bursts of FTP files. And that's why it was difficult to trace. We believe the total losses were somewhere around $90 million. This was reported in the business press. But it's funny, as of 2017, that's 4 years later, Target only paid a fine of about $18.5 million. Might have been, maybe should have been more than that. But This was, though, a kind of a career limiting issue for a lot of people that worked at Target. They had I think they've got a new chief security officer now. They they've had some turnover in their data center, and I think they learned their lesson because they had to pay for a lot of those credit cards to be replaced. But the bottom line is, Target did a lot of things wrong, and they didn't realize that they would be subject to such an attack. Now I'm going to back up and go through some slides here just briefly and talk about the mistakes everybody made along the way. So first of all, Fazio had not trained their employees to not click on these emails. You know, that's a pretty simple thing. But I will tell you that that's a harder thing than it sounds. It's one thing to say, you know, when this Nigerian prince sends you this email that says he wants to give you $20 million, most people know not to click on that. But if somebody sends you an email that says, hey, you shopped at our grocery store in our neighborhood, and here's a $5 gift certificate for Starbucks, you know, that sort of thing. Or this is your bank, you know, this is, you know, one of the bank in the area. We understand something odd has happened in your account. Please click this button and log into the bank here and do that. You know, those are the types of things that happen that people actually do click on. So we had a problem where people weren't trained. The employees did not notice their computers behaving suspiciously, things slowing down and doing different things. The Malwarebytes software is just fine, but it wasn't being run as a constant scan. So I would say that there's a kind of a failure in the IT policy there because they didn't run an antivirus program all the time. The malware itself was recognizable. This was a malware that had already existed for over a year, so there was no reason not to pick that up, but it means that people weren't keeping their stuff up to date. Now, there was a series of mistakes that happened with the partner portal. Target had believed that since this is a partner portal, it's not exposed to the public, therefore it doesn't need to be as secure. So they didn't lock it down as well as they should. It had not been tested, vetted, checked for vulnerabilities. They didn't keep the operating system and everything on that server up to date and patched and that sort of thing. That made this thing vulnerable to the next level of attack. That was that escalation of privileges attack. Next, remember the Active Directory server got hacked. They escalated credentials there. But more importantly, Target did not segment their network. At the very least, they should have had their point of sale terminals on a separate, you know, network, firewalled off from the rest of their network. They should have had their financial stuff separate and all that. So they built a flat network, and that was a problem because then it became painful when it finally got attacked. And on their passwords, you know, the Target clearly had a policy that passwords need to be about 8 characters in length, and you need to change your password every 90 days or something. But that wasn't really well enforced because a lot of these passwords are still in violation of that policy. And secondly, maybe that policy is not long enough. There's a new bit of research that NIST has done that says that it's not about having, you know, upper and lowercase characters, numbers, and special characters. More important than that is just the length of the password itself. The number one thing you can do to make a password stronger is to make it longer. And it goes so far, NIST goes so far as to say that rather than changing your password every 90 days or whatever the company policy is, maybe it's better not to change it, but just pick a much harder password. It turns out that if you force employees to change their password every 90 days, you're encouraging them to pick easier passwords because they're having to remember a new password every 90 days. I mean, it's like the old joke, my boss made me change my password, so now I have to rename my dog. So you gotta think about this, and what we are now advocating is a longer password. So what a lot of people will do is take a string of words, tree, flower, brook, mountain, or whatever, and type that out. Some people will take the first letter of lyrics of a song, on a dark desert highway, cool to wind in my face, you'll say A-D, H, and all the way through. You can remember that, but you need a password that's probably not just 8 characters. It needs to be 11, 12, 15, 16 characters long. That is a much, much stronger, more robust model. Now, the point of sale terminals failed to block the attackers themselves. So the manufacturer had made a mistake with these point of sale terminals.
Dave, sorry, I'm just
Yeah.
going to stop you for a
Mhm.
second. Can you
Okay.
just let us know what NIST is?
Oh, NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology. That's an organization in the U.S. federal government that they actually fall under the Commerce Department. So back many, many years ago, the Commerce Department was responsible for commerce, and they created NIST to manage weights and measures. The pound, the kilogram, the foot, the inch, the mile, all that. NIST does those things. But because they are affiliated with the government, and they're also technology oriented, the government has NIST now, according to the FISMA law back in 2002, NIST is responsible for computer security as well for the government. So NIST has come up with a bunch of policies called Special Publications, SPs, and there's an 800 series, and so SP 800-57 or whatever, you can find those documents. So NIST is a government agency that makes recommendations to the industry about the best way to be cyber secure, and fairly technical as well. So anyway, the point of sale terminals were designed by this manufacturer. They did not design in a way to check software before it comes in. Now, what most manufacturers should do is design it so it checks a checksum. So in software being uploaded to something like this, it's sensitive. The software itself should be encrypted or at least hashed, and the checksum validated against a known process. It could be a SHA-256, or whatever, but some sort of hash. The reason for that is to make sure the software has been written by the right people and not the wrong people. These point of sale terminals did not validate the software. And I would put a little bit of the blame on Target as well, because they didn't force the manufacturer to make that happen. They just didn't think it was a problem. Again, they thought they were in a safe network. They had the old style view of a perimeter-based defense where if you're inside the network, everything is trusted and safe, and that's just not true. So Target didn't impress the right requirements on the manufacturer, and the manufacturer didn't do the right thing in designing these terminals. Now, the Rescator, we've talked about some of this before. For those who are interested, this was an attack by what we would probably consider organized crime. Rescator is a guy that does this. We call it organized crime because the difference between crime and organized crime is payroll. In organized crime, they pay people to do a lot of the work, as opposed to just a group of people just doing it volunteer until they get paid. So this Rescator guy is a programmer. He probably hired other programmers. And if you think about the skill sets here, they had to do a phishing email campaign to get into the first attack. They had to take over machines with keyloggers. Then they had to do a website portal attack to get into that website portal. There's a lot of different attack skill sets that are represented here, but the most sophisticated is actually the code that goes into the point of sale terminal. This took some very deliberate, sophisticated programming. So that's why we believe they probably paid people to help them do this. So we're seeing more and more of that. And what's more important is the fact that it was a supply chain attack. So when Fazio was attacked, the attackers didn't go after Fazio because they were Fazio. They went after them because they were a Target supplier. So Target lost a lot of money. We've talked about that. The attack went forward for a few weeks there. They were streaming credit card numbers out of the country, and it was a huge loss for Target. I think it's interesting that their stock took a big hit that first week or two, and then slowly climbed back out again after they announced earnings, for the seasonal. They were pretty much back the way they were stock wise, and I don't like that. I wish the market would have penalized this kind of thing a little bit more than that, but that's just the way it goes in business. Now, to conclude here, I just want to point out just the high level points here. It's mostly human error. They clicked on a phishing email. They picked the cheapest virus protection and didn't even use it right. They designed that web portal for convenience and not security. They wrote some weak password policies. They didn't segment their network. And then finally, when the alarms started going off, they didn't even trust the tools that they had. They had no training on them. So the bottom line was, it wasn't computers that were hurt by all this, it was humans that were hurt. But we believe that humans are also the solution. Everything we talked about here, even though this attack happened 5 years ago, everything in this attack could probably happen pretty much the same way today. So it's like we haven't learned, we're still muddling along with some of this stuff. But as we move forward, we do believe that the strongest thing we can do to make sure these things don't happen again is to train the people. So that's where we're going to be. Now, let's open it up for some more questions.
So I have one question here about internal network segmentation is not a mandatory requirement of PC, like is it not a mandatory requirement for PCI DSS?
I don't think it is. I've studied the PCI DSS thing, and they require encryption for data in flight and encryption for data at rest, anywhere it's stored. But I don't think they necessarily require that data reside in a segmented network, because it has to cross multiple networks to get to the credit card company and back. So I don't think there's a reference to a segmented network in PCI DSS. It's just supposed to be encrypted.
What would be your recommendation for a corporate password policy? So I think you kind of touched on some of the things that they did wrong, but what would you recommend for a policy?
Okay. I would recommend at least 12 characters, maybe 16 characters. I would advocate for, upper lowercase numbers and special characters, but I would not require that they change the password every quarter. And the only other thing I would do is stress to employees, never, ever, ever use a password in more than one place. So whatever password you pick for your corporate environment, don't use that same password for your personal banking or your personal stuff. Always have a separate password, because it can get compromised in any location and the bad guys will run off. The only other thing is to be sensitive. If you do think you've clicked on a link and it's taken you to a fake login page and you might have entered your credentials, you must immediately change your credentials. So I think changing your login password, if you have a strong password, changing it should be event-driven, not calendar-driven. So I would advocate that. But I would say 12, 15 characters, maybe full words: tree, branch, stream, ocean, whatever, or pick random characters like the first letter of each word in a song title or something like that and put something together.
Saying, how did they eventually discover the attack?
Well, that's good. The Target eventually noticed the data leaking out and they shut it down. They called in the FBI immediately, and the FBI kind of shut everything down and did a quick analysis. They were able to flush the software out of those point of sale terminals pretty quickly, just by reloading them and then blocking those ports where it come in. The actual forensics of analyzing the attack and all that took weeks and weeks. But they did detect unusual behavior and finally triggered some alarms and finally picked it up. Next.
So was the software running on the supplier website server commercially available?
It was commercial software, but had been personalized for that vendor, for that retailer. And that happens a lot. You buy these packages and then you get to personalize it. It's modular and you can add different things to it.
Oh, so did the data leak through DNS? Was it encrypted when it was leaked out?
That's a good question. So nowadays, it's difficult to exfiltrate data out of a network because it's so easy to see a stream of data suddenly leaving your network, and that'll peg a lot of machines that'll set off alarms. This was back in 2013, so they didn't have to hide it. So what you're referring to there, very often we'll use a DNS, a domain name service. It converts a URL to an IP address, and it's a service that's provided by the network. And we'll use that same kind of service, and you can hide data in those messages to a fake DNS server, so it looks like standard web traffic. In the case of this thing that happened with Target, no, I think they were just running FTP stuff. It was not obfuscated the way you're talking about hidden inside DNS messages. This was just kind of open, but they were trying to trickle it so slowly that it wasn't obvious.
Okay. Another question. So you mentioned quite a few instances with like email training and password policy changes. And these are all human error. What kind of systems and processes are available to mitigate those kinds of human errors?
Okay, so first thing, yes, we have to train the humans. There are now some fairly good filters that have come up with Office 365 and Outlook and all that your Office, your Outlook server can do, and so a lot of email servers are now filtering a lot of this. Even Gmail, if you're using a Gmail service, they're picking up most of them. What tends to get through is not these mass emails anymore, but it's targeted, spear phishing type emails as opposed to phishing emails. But there are tools that will pick it up. There are proxies. There are tools that you can get for email servers that will automatically disable any links that are in the email. And in fact, there's some of them on the market today. I'm not going to name names. That it will take if an email comes through with a link in it, the system will quarantine that email, go and test that link, look for known malware, and if it shows bad malware at that website or whatever was on that link, then it won't let it through. So there's actually a test process. The attackers are getting more sophisticated, so they're obfuscating, the websites and things like that. Mostly that's what's happening. There's also a lot of whitelisting and blacklisting going on. People are doing their own DNS stuff. So if you click on a link in an email, but it's been blacklisted by your private DNS server, then you can't get to it as well. So for something like that, I would recommend using a commercial service, maybe even the 1.1.1.1 DNS service as well. That's very helpful because they'll block a lot of the bad stuff as well.
Okay, so when you mentioned the password change policy should be event-driven, does that mean you don't set them to expire?
That's correct. I think what I'm trying to avoid is this system where we have you have to change the password every 30 days or every 90 days. It has been proven empirically, and NIST did a lot of research on this. Humans tend to pick easier passwords if they have to change them frequently. And that's just the problem right there. So if you don't make them change them as frequently, they will pick harder passwords, better passwords. And that's what you really want to enforce. So that's why I say, but if it's event driven, it means if something happens, if someone leaves the company or they change their jobs in the company, if they clicked on an email that's just suspicious or something odd has happened, that's the time to change their password as quickly as they can. And that's what I mean by event driven. I don't like the whole calendar driven thing, but honestly, you probably at a minimum should change your passwords every year or so. I mean, I do that for all my personal stuff as well.
So then I have, is Target's application being used by other retailers? And have they been updated, or what kind of changes have they made for stronger securities?
Okay, so this was a partner portal application, and I believe in the slides we had SAP or SAP. I'm not sure it was SAP. I think it was, but the bigger point is I think a lot of the application vendors that do these business process flow applications, they've gotten a lot smarter over the last 2 or 3 years. But the critical thing to understand is that if you buy a business process flow application from one of these vendors and you customize it for your business and you install it, you're still responsible for the security, not just the vendor of that software. So you have to test it yourself, run your own vulnerability scans, and you have to make sure the underlying infrastructure under that is still safe. For example, you can install some application on a server and start using it, but if you haven't patched the operating system or you haven't patched Apache struts or something like that, I mean, that's what got Equifax in trouble. You got to keep everything in the infrastructure up to date, and the software vendor can't do that for you. They can only hope you do it. So it's a combination of responsibility. The software vendors have gotten better. We've got to keep their feet to the fire to keep getting better and keep fixing holes and vulnerabilities. But you have to accept some responsibility yourself to make sure everything's up to date.
But so with these credit cards, were they all swipe credit cards, or would the chip cards that are out now, would those have helped in the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, yeah, these were all magnetic strip credit cards. The new chip cards would be much, much more robust against this kind of attack because with a chip card, when you stick it in the reader, it doesn't pass the actual number into the reader. There's a challenge and response handshake that happens where the card proves that it knows the secret by responding appropriately to the challenge and response, but it doesn't have to reveal the secret. So you validate the card that way, and that's a much stronger method. And so in the case of a chip card, you would not be holding the credit card number in memory to be scraped like it was in this attack. Even more robust would be a chip and pin, where you actually have to enter a pin number in addition to the chip. But we don't really enforce that in the United States. They have it in Europe, but we don't have it here.
Here, if you want to continue your cybersecurity knowledge, of course, Global Knowledge has some courses available for people to continue on no matter what level or stages you are in IT. So Cybersecurity Foundations is a great place to start, building that foundational knowledge, getting to know best practices, learning a lot of the terminology. As well as some specialized courses like the one listed there. So we have the cybersecurity specialization with government risk and compliance, going a little more on that policy side and mitigation and risk analysis as well. And we also have, as far as IT certifications go, and Dave, you can speak to this one as well since you have the Security Plus certification. Anything they should know about that?
Well, it's a good basic certification. I'd strongly recommend starting with Security Plus, but we've got dozens of certifications, training we offer in all kinds of things. And I would recommend, go down that path and get a lot of certifications. They're all accessible. If you have some basic technology background, it really makes it a good way to measure your progress as you go through your career. So Security Plus is probably a really good one to start with, and then start going off from there.
Okay. So going to the next slide, and of course, this is just the beginning of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So here at Global Knowledge, we've provided a lot of complimentary resources to help you take action against and increase your cybersecurity skills. So technical overviews, there's cybersecurity awareness posters that can be put up around your offices. We have live webinars like this one today, and there are 2 more on the schedule for this month around cybersecurity as well, one on October 10th and one on October 24th. So please go check out our website, and if you're interested in signing up for more of those. And you can find them all in one place at the link down there, our Cybersecurity Awareness Month portal for you.